Depot. Let's take a closer look at tensions in the region with Tina Fordham, who is the founder of Fordham Global Foresight and geopolitical strategist and advisor. Tina, let's start there. This conflict, this risk of escalation in the Middle East, what odds are you putting on that?
Well, the risk of escalation is ever present. I think if we see ceasefires, they're not going to be ceasefires. They're going to be these very brief humanitarian pauses. And that underscores the extent to which Israel is committed to pursuing its agenda of eradicating Hamas. This is very hard to do with a terrorist group. So what that means is that the potential for escalation doesn't go away. The U.S. has moved even more serious military assets to the Med off the coast of Israel. And not only that, it's telegraphed that it's done so. The emphasis will be on keeping the attacks sort of below radar so that they, or at least below the threshold, rather, of provoking a full-blown military escalation. I think if there is any good news in this very grim security situation, it is that it appears that Hezbollah and Iran would prefer to stay on the sidelines and, perhaps make sporadic attacks. That doesn't mean that this couldn't still get much worse.
Sporadic attacks, but they've already kind of warned. It's almost like their bark is worse than their bite, it kind of feels like. And yet these attacks that you're seeing from the United States into Syria on weapons depots that are allegedly used by Iran specifically, the timing of this is really interesting. Why do you think now is being chosen to target those weapons depots in Syria, of all places?
To limit the potential for a wider regional conflagration. And let's remember, for investors who maybe have forgotten what geopolitical risk contagion looks like, this has the potential to be a systemic conflict. I feel that investors are much too complacent that it remains confined to Israel and the Palestinian territories rather than something broader. Of course, even the Iraq wars had pretty limited geopolitical contagion, but that was against a really different fiscal, monetary, and economic backdrop.
Do you see the defense budget kind of accelerating here? I mean, that was a point of contention while we didn't have the Speaker of the House in the United States, and now billions of aid, I think $14 billion to Israel, I think something like $60 billion to Ukraine. Those are rough numbers. But do you feel like the aid, the defense budget, is going to accelerate here when it comes to the Middle East?
Well, there's the aid budget, and then there's the defense budget, right? So the House of Representatives and all of the political drama there has underscored the extent to which supporting Israel is more popular with Republicans in the House, with a lot of resistance on Ukraine. This, to my view, is a huge risk for geopolitics. The historian Timothy Snyder has said that the best China policy is a good Ukraine policy, and I'm a believer in that. But where, as we look into our 2024 outlook, we start to see this potentially quite toxic, I'm calling it a doom loop, between electoral politics in the United States and even here in the UK, and how to best support Israel and kind of have red lines against terrorism and other sorts of inflammatory moves, starts to interact in a way that is very problematic for aid budgets. I think defense goes in a different bucket. However, the U.S. already spends more on defense than anyone else, and that's not going to change, I think, under any government.
But I guess it imagines where that defense actually goes at the end of the day, which brings me back to the electoral politics that you were just talking about. We've got a general election in the UK due next year. We have, of course, the U.S. presidential election as well. In terms of foreign policy and President Biden's reputation around foreign policy, first in Ukraine and now in Israel, and I would argue in the fall of Kabul as well and the pullout from Afghanistan, do you feel like foreign policy might dictate the election more so than anything else?
Well, I'm going to put it in a slightly different way, because any U.S. pollster will tell you that Americans don't make their decisions at the polling booth on the basis of foreign policy. But what we're seeing, and this is, again, part of this sort of doom loop thesis that I'm talking about, is how the U.S. left, and to a certain extent the UK left here, where, remember, support for the Iraq War under Tony Blair was and still is such a divisive issue, the kind of further fragmentation of the American left could have the pretty paradoxical effect of boosting, for example, Donald Trump's prospects. I say paradoxical because Donald Trump was the person who instituted a Muslim ban during his time in office. And the idea that the left's divisions over U.S. support for Israel and as well as concern about the policy to support Palestinians in Gaza might actually affect turnout from Democrats is an important one. And it is, just another wild card in a 2024 U.S. election, which isn't going to look like anything we've seen before.
I love that you mentioned kind of this electoral piece of the equation, because if you look at protests from around the world, they are happening. I think we are, 6 weeks into this war or 5 weeks and going on week 6. Every single weekend in every major capital of the world, you have seen protests for both sides, obviously, but a massive kind of pro-Palestinian turnout in the United States that I think a lot of people didn't necessarily expect to see in the United States. I'm curious in terms of the turnout when it comes to other wars like Ukraine and Russia, for example, or other issues around the world. Is this the distraction that Vladimir Zelensky says it is?
I'll use a different terminology because you are quite right to draw the contrast between the uproar, particularly, but not only on the left, about sort of military support for Israel's actions, compared to, who has seen large-scale demonstrations in support of innocent civilian Ukrainians? What does that tell us? It tells us that the Middle East conflict is a lightning rod for global public opinion in a unique way, right? And I think that that's for investors, for business leaders, understanding the extent to which it galvanizes public opinion in an already fragmented landscape and can act as a driver changing election outcomes is extremely important. U.S.-China relations are poor. U.S. public opinion about China is poor. It has a modest impact, at the most, on voting behavior.
And that doesn't even begin to describe some of the pain points with Saudi Arabia, for example, and the issues there as well. Tina Fordham, sadly, we have to leave it there. I'm so sorry. I wish I had a whole hour with you. She's, of course, the founder of Fordham Global Foresight and a geopolitical strategist and advisor, joining us right here on The Pulse. Now, as she was talking about, the Middle East has always been not only, as she put it, a lightning rod for geopolitics, but also a lightning rod and really a global crossroad for air travel as well. And that's where I want to go next. Now, rising tensions forcing airlines to